Hey guys, tonight we'll drift through what getting high and being drunk actually felt like in the medieval world, along with a handful of other strange little corners of history. Long before anyone could walk into a shop and buy a bottle off a shelf, people everywhere had already found their own ways to soften the edges of an ordinary day. Drink and the search for altered feeling are nearly as old as settled life itself, woven into harvest festivals, sacred rituals, quiet evenings, and the long stretches of work that filled most lives. What changed from one age to the next was not the wish for it, but the shape that wish was allowed to take, and the meanings people hung upon it. In the centuries we now call medieval, much of daily drinking had little to do with pleasure, and a great deal to do with simple survival. Water drawn from rivers, wells, and town ditches was often far from clean, and in crowded places it could carry sickness that no one yet understood. Ale, by contrast, was brewed and gently boiled, and it tended to be safer to swallow. Because of this, a weak everyday ale became part of nearly every table, poured for labourers and children alike, sipped through the morning and across the working hours. It was less a treat than a quiet necessity, closer to bread than to anything we would now think of as a vice. This ordinary ale was usually thin and only mildly strong, meant to be taken in steady amounts without leaving a person unable to work. Households brewed it in their own kitchens, and much of that brewing fell to women who were sometimes known as alewives. They made it in modest batches, set it out for sale, and marked the fresh supply by hanging a bundle of greenery or a pole above the door, a plain signal that drink was ready within. In this way brewing sat woven into the rhythm of the home and the village, an everyday craft rather than a grand industry. Often the recipes behind these brews could just as easily have stripped the leather off a shoe. Did they cure anything? Possibly. Or possibly they simply scrubbed the original complaint from memory entirely. The real charm of these medieval concoctions was that nobody could say in advance how things would go. Would the night bring restful sleep, a quiet conversation with angels, or a fit of howling at the moon and pledging undying devotion to a root vegetable? There was only one way to find out, which brings us to the broomstick, that famous flying companion of the medieval witch. Today it feels harmless, the property of bedtime stories and costume shops, but in its own era it carried a rather indelicate reputation. The short version is that the broomstick had purposes well beyond sweeping floors. The bond between witches and their brooms turns out to have a chemical explanation, and not merely the mandrake everyone expects. Old documents, particularly those penned by deeply suspicious inquisitors, mention witches relying on flying ointments, dense trance-inducing salves prepared from plants such as henbane, belladonna, and datura, none of which could be called gentle company. The notable detail is that these ointments were never swallowed, since the ingredients were poisonous and the digestive system tends to object loudly. They were applied to the skin instead, and more specifically to certain absorbent membranes of the body. That is where the broomstick re-enters the story, described in some accounts with great tact as a staff prepared for travel. The handle, in other words, served as a means of delivering the salve to regions that absorbed it readily. Hardly a children's tale, yet apparently quite effective. Within minutes, those who used it described sailing through the dark sky, joining banquets hosted by the devil, or merely drifting above the rooftops of the village like the most disoriented bird imaginable. These were, of course, hallucinations, but in a time when medicine, magic, and mysticism all shared the same cramped quarters, few thought to challenge the experience. Inquisitors and theologians paid close attention, though not out of any curiosity about plant chemistry. They read the sensation of flight as proof of dealings with demons, which is a touch ironic given that the visions were chemically produced and wildly inconsistent. But medieval justice rarely troubled itself with anything resembling proof. While much of Europe was smearing toxins on broom handles and calling it flight, something considerably more refined was unfolding to the south and east in the thriving cities of the Islamic Golden Age. This is where hashish enters the picture, a plant-based reply to weariness and worry. Made from the resin of the cannabis plant, hashish saw wide use across regions like Persia, Egypt, and the Levant. In contrast to Europe's habit of anointing oneself and bracing for a meeting with Satan, scholars, mystics, and physicians of the Islamic world recorded its effects with a thoroughness that hints at careful observation. Hashish was usually eaten rather than applied, often blended with honey, spices, or various herbs, which made it perhaps the first edible that genuinely tasted pleasant, unlike the bitter brews and foul-smelling remedies common further north. Its appeal was not purely recreational, though that certainly featured. Hashish was frequently linked to Sufism, the mystical strand of Islam whose practitioners pursued spiritual union with the divine. Many believed it could loosen the grip of the ego, settle the mind, and open the way to deep reflection, or at the very least encourage long contemplative gazing at a wall. A good number of Sufi poets and philosophers wrote about hashish, much as today's songwriters dwell on painful breakups, full of strong feeling, abstract imagery, and just enough haze to leave one wondering how they were holding up. Naturally, it had its critics. Various Islamic rulers attempted to outlaw it from time to time, worried it bred idleness, moral decline, or excessive giggling during prayer. Yet, like most attempts to ban a substance throughout history, these efforts succeeded about as well as instructing a cat in the art of juggling. The famous order, sometimes called the Original Assassins, was even rumoured to take hashish before their missions in order to steel themselves for what lay ahead. That story is largely legend, but it captures nicely how cannabis products were already cloaked in both wonder and distrust. Europe, meanwhile, remained centuries from grasping how to use cannabis without setting something ablaze or branding it the devil's weed. When you imagine a medieval church, the mind tends to fill with stained glass, guttering candles, solemn singing, and that heavy, almost unearthly haze of incense drifting through the space like some divine smoke machine. Yet incense served more than holiness. It also carried a certain hidden quality, a measure of psychoactive potential. Officially, they were meant to purify the air, drive off evil spirits, and make a room smell a little less like damp wool and fish stew. The surprising part is that modern research has found burning frankincense to release compounds, among them insensol acetate, capable of acting on the brain's limbic system. In plainer terms, if you sat long enough in the smoke, the chanting was not the only thing leaving your head pleasantly light. In the poorly ventilated chapels of the age, which is to say all of them, lingering exposure to incense could produce a faintly calming effect, especially when combined with fasting, dehydration, or sheer tedium. Reports of monks and worshippers seeing visions during lengthy services were not unusual, and while they tended to attribute these to divine inspiration, some may simply have been mildly affected by the resin fumes. And if this seems a strictly Christian affair, it was anything but. Incense featured regularly in mosques, synagogues, Buddhist temples, and pre-Christian pagan rites alike. It crossed every religious boundary, since a pleasant atmosphere apparently appeals to everyone. The clergy maintained that the smoke lifted the soul toward heaven. More plausibly, it softened the sharp edges of reality enough to make a 5-hour sermon somewhat easier to endure, rather like the medieval counterpart to quiet background music and a scented candle, only with more Latin and far less calm. If medieval people could rely on anything besides taxes and the occasional plague, it was alcohol. Beer, ale, mead, wine, cider, the list goes on. And somewhere behind nearly every house, someone was fermenting a batch in a wooden barrel and calling it medicine. In a sense, it was. Drinking water carried real dangers, since most natural sources were either tainted or sat conveniently downstream from livestock, which made a sip from the stream a gamble with one's insides. So people turned to something fermented instead. This is where small beer comes in, a sort of medieval everyday water, but with a little alcohol and a far greater chance of having been brewed by someone named Edith, who measured her ingredients by instinct and prayer. This weak drink was a daily staple for adults and children alike, the goal being not drunkenness but survival, accompanied by steady hydration and a gentle buzz. Not every medieval drink was so modest, of course. Anyone wealthier, or simply with an empty schedule, might reach for stronger ale, honey mead, or imported wine. Wine was often steeped with herbs or spices, whether for taste, supposed medicinal benefit, or pure experiment. In the monasteries, brewing came close to a sacred obligation. Monks refined their recipes, recorded their fermentation methods, and sampled the results with notable dedication. If salvation could be poured into a cup, the Benedictines were comfortably ahead of everyone else. But alcohol was not merely a beverage, it was something closer to a way of life. To dull the agony of medieval dentistry, there was ale. To ease a heavy mood, spiced wine. To briefly forget a cramped, draughty house shared with 6 other people and one deeply disapproving chicken, there was mead. Taverns, inns, and roadside alehouses functioned as the era's counselling rooms, only with considerably more shouting. People drank to celebrate, to grieve, to trade gossip, and now and then to invent entirely new styles of dancing that nobody had requested. Sometimes intoxication in the Middle Ages was not a choice at all, but simply breakfast. The culprit was ergot, a parasitic fungus that takes hold on rye and other cereal grains. To an ordinary medieval eye, it resembled little more than an odd, darkened kernel. To a modern scientist, it looks like a biological practical joke, complete with effects that read like a curse, convulsions, hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs, and at times the conviction that one's hands had become spiders. This fungus turned up by accident in what some historians describe as the original LSD experience. Long before the Summer of Love, Woodstock, or anything involving tie-dye, people across parts of Europe, particularly in the colder and damper regions like France and the Germanic lands, regularly baked their bread from infected rye, because hunger easily outweighed any awareness of fungus. Whole villages would therefore consume ergot-tainted loaves without knowing it, and the consequences were at once astonishing and dreadful. There were 2 varieties of the affliction, which did indeed have a name. Convulsive ergotism brought muscle spasms, seizures, hallucinations, and bouts of laughter or terror. Gangrenous ergotism choked off the blood supply, so that limbs blackened, withered, and dropped away, hardly the stuff of pleasant gatherings. Local outbreaks produced strange public spectacles, among them the dancing plagues, in which crowds danced helplessly for days on end, sometimes until they died. At the time, the blame fell on demons, divine punishment, or moral failing, when in truth it may have amounted to a mass case of unintentional fungal toast. There is a certain irony in the fact that the Order of St. Anthony, which operated hospitals for sufferers, treated victims of ergotism in part by switching them to wheat-based diets instead of rye. So the remedy, it turned out, was simply different bread. Did anyone piece this together? Not really. To a medieval baker, bread was either fine or plainly possessed, and nobody was screening their porridge for psychoactive alkaloids, being far too occupied with avoiding excommunication. Even now, some scholars suspect ergot played a part in the Salem witch trials, the hallucinations, fits and paranoia all fitting the pattern, though that remains a matter of debate. What is not in dispute is that medieval Europe was getting high on toast without the faintest idea it was happening. You have likely heard of magic mushrooms, and you have heard of flying ointments, but mad honey may be less familiar. In a few unusual pockets of the medieval world, even the bees were taking part. This was no ordinary honey from a shelf, but a rare sort produced in the mountainous Black Sea districts of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where the bees gathered from rhododendron blossoms, pretty pink flowers hiding a darker quality. The blooms carry grainotoxins, naturally occurring compounds that do not cooperate well with the human nervous system. The outcome was mad honey, potent enough to bring on dizziness, hallucinations, sickness, a slowed heartbeat, and visions of a spiritual sort, more or less in that sequence. In tiny amounts it offered a faint lift. In larger amounts it transformed the day into a slow-motion drama starring one's own eyebrows. This was more than a regional oddity, for it was also turned into a weapon. According to ancient and medieval accounts, invading armies were sometimes deliberately undone by mad honey left behind in deserted villages. Soldiers assumed they had stumbled on free provisions, only to find themselves collapsing on the forest floor, grasping far too late that the treat was not to be trusted. Greek and Roman writers had described these effects centuries earlier, yet the practice carried on well into the Middle Ages. The local people understood how to manage it, a little spread on bread for a headache, a little stirred into wine for visions, or none at all if one hoped to recall one's own name by nightfall. Mad honey came to be regarded as both a remedy and a recreational indulgence, especially within mystical or folk healing traditions. Some who took it claimed it granted prophetic dreams, while others simply woke clutching a potato they were convinced was their uncle. Results varied. And yes, it was traded, with enterprising merchants selling it in small ceramic jars and generally no dosage guidance, since warning labels seemed beside the point in an era when leeches passed for advanced medicine. Not everyone in the Middle Ages was a priest, a noble, or a plague-stricken peasant. Some moved through the dim margins of society as shamans, herbalists, cunning folk, and other semi-respectable dealers in medicine and mischief, rather like medieval apothecaries with no oversight whatsoever, and a profound personal fondness for moss. They were the people you sought out when the village doctor responded to a toothache by proposing to open a vein. No diploma hung on their wall, but they carried plant lore handed down across the generations, frequently absorbed by watching a grandmother tend boils with strips of bark and a steady calm. And where substances that shifted the mind were concerned, these were the figures you approached. They understood which plants to crush into a paste, which roots to steep in wine, and what dose of a particular herb might leave you dreaming of angels rather than unexpectedly meeting them. Whether the aim was easing an ache, summoning a vision, cursing the household next door, or floating outside oneself in the middle of folding laundry, they had a cure, or possibly several. A great many of these healers were women, the midwives and the wise women who held their communities together and unsettled those in charge. Not on account of cackling over bubbling pots, but because they knew a great deal and required no Latin to account for it. Henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and substances drawn from the poppy appeared again and again in their work. These would be blended with wine, with fat, with honey, even with spit, no exaggeration there, accompanied by a few muttered words of protection, and off you went carrying something that might mend you, or might leave you fervently confessing to deeds you had never done. Naturally, if matters took a wrong turn, perhaps a vision of soaring goats or an abrupt longing to wed an oak, the explanation pivoted at once from a faulty mixture to sorcery. The church and the local powers watched these people with one steady eye and another that flickered nervously. Even so, the community leaned on them. When a child burned with fever, when joints ached, or when someone needed to reach a departed relative about where the rent money had been tucked away, these were the figures one turned to. Not physicians, not clergy. They were the earliest underground wellness influencers. So, after all the salves, the brews, the roots, the ointments, the incense, the bees, and the dubious bread, one large question lingers. What did medieval people genuinely make of being intoxicated? The answer is conflicted. Profoundly, almost comically conflicted. To some, the healers and herbalists above all, mind-altering substances served a plain purpose. If a thing softened pain, settled a feverish head, or made childbirth 1% less dreadful, it earned a welcome. This was treatment, not trouble. The patient might begin chanting psalms in reverse or claiming the cat had taken up French, but if the swelling subsided, the matter counted as a triumph. Then came the spiritual seekers, the monks, the mystics, and those reaching toward the divine. For them, hallucinations carried no warning. They were revelations. A vision signaled holiness rather than illness. If you peered into the emptiness, and the emptiness murmured back in Latin, you were well on your way toward sainthood, or at the least toward a chapel painted in your honor. Yet purpose was everything. Slipping into a daze by mistake was tolerable. Doing so to glimpse Jesus was acceptable. Doing so to court a goat-shaped demon, that became a difficulty. This was the moment the church intervened, marking certain substances and the people who used them as questionable at best and heretical at worst. Anything tied to a loss of command, whether drunkenness, a trance, or an awkward burst of candour, set clerical brows rising. Saints were permitted visions. Peasants were likely just possessed. Among the ordinary folk, meanwhile, the mood was easier. A neighbour's sleeping draught might also serve as a mild nightcap that bent the senses. People reached for poppy wine to dull pain, for hashish to find some quiet, and for henbane tea to weather a visit from relations by marriage. None of it struck them as mystical or defiant. It simply belonged in the cupboard of cures, sitting beside the garlic and the prayers. In the end, how the experience was judged depended on who you happened to be, what you had taken, and whether anyone went tattling. To the medieval mind, altered states occupied an odd middle ground, somewhere between a miracle and a petty offence, between good health and heresy. And in a world where demons, saints, plagues, and turnip famines all kept company, an occasional herbal retreat was hardly the worst notion going. In the ancient world, the sea was no empty gap to be ferried across. It was the throbbing centre of empire. It bore grain, gold, dispatches, soldiers, and at times warfare itself. Whoever held the seas owned far more than the water. They steered the destiny of whole civilizations. Where land battles bent to the shape of the ground, fighting at sea turned on control of movement, of trade, of communication, and of reach. For seafaring states such as Athens, Carthage, and Egypt, mastery of the water was not a luxury. It was a matter of survival. Lacking fleets, cities lay open to isolation, hunger, and siege. Possessing them, those cities could seal off rivals, shield their merchant convoys, and even set troops ashore far behind enemy lines. Consider the Mediterranean. The name Middle Sea was no accident. This enclosed ocean joined 3 continents and a multitude of peoples. To rule it was to keep a hand on everything from Phoenician trade lanes to Roman grain deliveries. The sea could deliver riches as quickly as it delivered ruin. That is why the ancient powers funneled their wealth into the machinery of sea power, into harbours, shipyards, dry docks, and navies. For Athens, the fleet grew into its very lifeblood. Themistocles, and his vision of a force built on triremes, transformed the city into a thalassocracy, an empire rooted in the sea. Its ships guarded the grain routes out of Egypt, drew tribute from allies, and dashed Persian ambitions in clashes such as Salamis. Carthage, by contrast, rose to naval greatness from a merchant beginning. Its dockyards ranked among the most advanced anywhere in the ancient world, turning out warships at nearly industrial speed. Carthaginian supremacy rested on more than military muscle. It drew on generations of sailors and navigators who knew the sea as if it were their own skin. Egypt, set strategically where the Nile met the Red Sea, likewise depended on fleets to safeguard its trade with the Levant and Nubia. Though more river-minded by habit, Egyptian warships matured into seagoing craft fit to skirmish with pirates and escort ships laden with treasure. In every one of these cases, war at sea was no sideshow. It was the central drama. The sea was where rivals collided, where alliances shattered, and where empires either thrived or sank. Command of naval tactics, technology, and geography gave birth to legends. And when those fleets burned or went under, the fortunes of the powerful followed them down. The trireme was not merely a vessel, it was a weapon. Lean, swift, and lethal, it shaped naval warfare across the whole Mediterranean. And while many city-states constructed them, none handled them with the skill of the Athenians. With 3 banks of oars and a bronze-capped ram, the trireme stood as the ancient counterpart to a guided missile, though this one ran on sweat, on rhythm, and on strategy. A standard trireme stretched roughly 120 feet in length and barely 18 across. Narrow, certainly, but that was the whole idea. Its slender hull cut through the water with little drag, while its shallow draft allowed it to work close to shore for raids and landings. The name trireme points to its 3 rows of oars set one above another. Nor were these just any oarsmen. Each was a trained seaman, schooled to pull in perfect unison at speeds that could reach 9 knots in the heat of battle. The trireme's most dreaded asset was the ram, a bronze-clad prow strengthened with oak and built to crash into enemy hulls with shattering force. Yet ramming was not simply a question of speed. It demanded exact timing and a precise angle. Strike too squarely and your own ship might wedge fast or even tip over. Accomplished captains, the Athenian ones among them, mastered the art of the diekplaus, a manoeuvre of sliding through the enemy line, wheeling sharply, and striking the exposed sides. Up on deck, the trireme carried a modest band of marines, generally 10 to 20 heavily armed hoplites along with a handful of archers. Their task was to storm enemy decks or to fend off such an attack. But make no mistake, a trireme was not a floating fortress. It depended on agility rather than armor. A single misstep, and you became kindling. What truly set the Athenian trireme fleet apart was not the ship alone, it was the system that stood behind it. Drawing on the Thearica, a public naval fund, Athens built and maintained hundreds of triremes. Citizens, even the poorest among them, served at the oars, fashioning a curious sort of democracy upon the water. When Athens broke the Persian fleet at Salamis in 480 BCE, the victory did not belong to aristocrats, it belonged to the common people. Combat at sea in ancient times was no slugfest of roaring cannon. It resembled high-speed chess interrupted by the occasional street brawl. The chief aim was to cripple or sink the enemy before they could do the same to you. And the principal instrument for that was the ram. Ramming sat at the heart of naval tactics throughout the trireme age. The objective was to puncture an enemy's hull below the waterline using the ship's bronze-tipped prow. A well-aimed ram could carry a vessel to the seabed within minutes. But the matter was hardly a simple charge ahead. Timing, angle, and coordination weighed enormously. Approach too sharply, and you would merely glance away. Come on too directly, and you might lodge your own ship inside theirs, leaving both craft exposed. To bring off a clean ram, fleets relied on intricate maneuvers like the Dieplus and the Periplus. In the first, a ship would dart through openings in the enemy line, then swing around to strike from behind. The Periplus meant circling the enemy formation to fall upon its open flanks. These were not displays of raw force, they were precise strikes resting on the oarsman's synchronization and the captain's foresight. Yet at times the plan unravelled. Rams went wide, ships locked fast together, oars splintered. That was when the alternative arrived. Boarding turned a sea fight into a land-style melee. Once two ships struck or grappled, marines would spring across to the enemy vessel with swords, spears, and shields. These were no delicate encounters. Boarding meant savage, close-quarters fighting, nearer to a gang brawl than to an orderly phalanx. Archers and slingers heaped on chaos from the higher decks, picking off anyone who let too much helmet show. Certain fleets, the Romans foremost among them, came in time to prefer boarding over ramming. They even devised special contraptions such as the corvus, a boarding plank fitted with a spike that could latch onto an enemy ship and convert a sea battle into a floating land fight. This approach helped Rome overcome the more seasoned Carthaginian sailors during the First Punic War, because what the Romans wanted in seamanship they made up in sheer weight of infantry. It also meant, of course, that naval battles grew bloodier and more disordered still. There was no turning back once boarding began. It was kill or be killed on a deck slippery with seawater, blood, and shattered timber. If ramming was the scalpel of ancient naval warfare, then fire was its sledgehammer. No sight inspired more dread than a blazing ship driving toward your fleet. Fire ships were the Navy's version of controlled chaos, a weapon so perilous that it often endangered the one who launched it as much as the foe. Though never as common as triremes or boarding actions, fire tactics surfaced early and grew more refined over time. The underlying notion was straightforward. Pack a ship with flammable matter, pitch, tar, sulfur, resin and oil, set it ablaze, and steer it toward enemy vessels. The hope was that the fire ship would drift into the densely packed enemy line, setting alight the sails, the decks, and anything else unlucky enough to catch. One of the earliest recorded uses of fire ships comes out of the Greco-Persian conflicts, where hard-pressed defenders attempted to throw back naval invasions by flinging burning rafts or boats toward enemy galleys. In the cramped confines of a harbour or a strait where there was little room to manoeuvre, a lone fire ship could spread mass panic and shatter formations. But fire upon the water cut both ways. Winds could turn, flames could rebound. A badly timed fire ship could wreck your own fleet just as readily as the enemy's. This is why fire was usually held back for desperate hours, for blockades, surprise assaults, or last stands where the gamble justified the wreckage. The most advanced step in ancient incendiary warfare arrived with Greek fire, a strange and terrifying weapon developed by the Byzantine Empire centuries afterward, yet drawing on these earlier fire tactics. Greek fire could supposedly burn upon water and resisted every ordinary attempt to put it out. Although it belongs more to the medieval era than to antiquity, the underlying idea, chemical fire harnessed for control of the seas, reaches back to these primitive fire ships. Egyptian and Phoenician squadrons relied on their own takes on flame weaponry as well, especially when facing raiders or pressing a siege. Defenders along the coast, for example, might fling burning pots or loose flaming arrows at vessels trying to force their way into a harbour. Nothing rivaled the dread that fire stirred at sea. A ram could be deflected, a boarding party could be driven back. Yet fire was another matter entirely. It threw crews into chaos, ate through timber hulls, and outran any command a captain could shout. Even seasoned mariners might leap overboard at the first hint of pitch and smoke. In the 5th century BCE, Athens remade itself from an inward-looking city-state into a commanding sea power, and the whole story began with silver. After a rich silver seam came to light in the mines at Laurium, a forward-thinking Athenian statesman, Themistocles, persuaded his fellow citizens to pour the windfall into the future rather than share it out. His proposal was simple: build a great many triremes. That single choice altered the course of history. At its height, the Athenian fleet numbered more than 200 warships and grew into the spine of what we now call the Athenian Empire. The city's might no longer rested on heavy infantry or fortified walls. It rode on timber, toil, and clever planning. That victory not only spared Athens, it set the city up as the guardian and soon the master of the Aegean. Through the Delian League, Athens started collecting payments from allied states, ostensibly for shared maritime defence. In reality, those funds frequently bankrolled Athenian ambitions, from new ships to grand public buildings. The fleet let Athens compel obedience, put down revolts, and extend its reach well past its own coastline. Yet the story went beyond raw force. The navy also reshaped Athenian society. The poorest men, unable to buy armour or own the land that qualified one to fight as a hoplite, became indispensable as rowers aboard the triremes. That role earned them real political weight, reshaping the assembly and lifting up the lower classes. Mastery of the sea translated into power for ordinary people. This supremacy, however, carried a cost. Athens leaned too heavily on its navy and handled its allies harshly, breeding deep resentment. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta, long a land-bound power, used Persian funding to assemble a fleet of its own and ultimately shattered the Athenian navy at Agospotami in 405 BCE. With its ships destroyed, Athens was besieged into starvation and surrender. Even so, the legacy of Athenian sea power lived on. It demonstrated that a city-state short on territory could rise to imperial heights by mastering the water. It also showed that ships could serve as instruments of politics every bit as much as instruments of war. If Athens held sway over the Aegean, Carthage commanded the western Mediterranean. Established by Phoenician colonists around 800 BCE in what is today Tunisia, Carthage grew powerful not through conquest alone, but through commerce, seamanship, and naval ingenuity without equal. By the 4th century BCE, Carthage was far more than a prosperous city. It was the beating heart of a vast maritime web stretching from Spain to Sicily and from North Africa to Sardinia. That power rested squarely on the fleet. Where the Athenians had perfected the trireme, the Carthaginians lifted shipbuilding to something close to industrial scale. Their dockyards, above all, the immense circular harbour of Carthage itself, could construct and shelter hundreds of warships. These figures were no exaggeration. Carthage operated a dock arrangement run almost like an assembly line, permitting swift building and repair on a scale the ancient world had never seen. Carthaginian vessels, frequently quadriremes or quinquiremes, were bulkier than Athenian triremes and built for force as much as for speed. Their fighting approach favoured ramming and boarding, backed by hardened mercenary marines and Libyan-Phoenician sailors raised on the water. The city's grip on the sea was about trade as well as battle. Carthaginian merchants worked the Atlantic shores of Europe and Africa, dealt in tin and silver, and returned with rare and costly goods. The navy made sure that pirates, competing traders, and Roman designs never disrupted that profitable stream. And then the Punic Wars arrived. Rome, on the rise across the Italian peninsula, understood that beating Carthage required a navy where none existed. When they seized a beached Carthaginian quinquireme, they copied it down to the last detail, adding the corvus, a boarding plank that cancelled out Carthage's finer seamanship by turning sea fights into land brawls. Even after early losses, Carthage stood firm thanks to gifted admirals and tactical brilliance. Across the First Punic War, the Carthaginians fought dozens of major engagements at sea. At Drepana, they pulled off a faultless manoeuvre that wrecked a Roman fleet despite the odds, proof that Carthage still understood how to rule the waves. But in the end, numbers wore down skill. Roman doggedness, stronger supply chains, and unforgiving discipline shifted the balance. By the close of the Second Punic War, Carthage's fleet had vanished, its shipyards were torn apart, and its power was undone. Still, the legend of Carthaginian command of the sea endures. They were not merely fighters on the water. They were shrewd traders, inventive shipwrights, and daring navigators who once ruled the seas through cunning, wealth, and timber. Picture ancient Egypt and pyramids, pharaohs and temples come to mind, not war fleets. Yet Egypt was among the first civilizations to take up naval power, both along the Nile and out on open water. Its ships never gained the fame of Greek triremes or Carthaginian quinquiremes, but for thousands of years Egypt depended on boats to hold its realm together, move soldiers, and guard the trade that fed its wealth. The Nile was Egypt's great roadway, an artery binding north to south, desert to delta. As early as 3000 BCE, Egyptian builders were shaping craft from bundled papyrus reeds and, later, from cedar brought in from Lebanon. Those riverboats carried grain, gold, troops, and even towering statues. Pharaohs sent naval ventures south into Nubia and east, across the Red Sea to Punt, a far-off land brimming with incense, ivory, and unusual animals. But Egyptian sea ambitions did not stop at the river. By the era of the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 170 BCE, Egypt had built seafaring fleets able to challenge raiders, fend off invasions, and project strength beyond its frontiers. Under leaders such as Thutmose III and Ramses III, Egypt deployed warships against the Sea Peoples, a loose coalition of marauders menacing the eastern Mediterranean. Those clashes, captured in striking carvings at Medinet Habu, depict Egyptian archers shooting from their decks and marines locked in savage close quarters fighting on cramped wooden platforms. In contrast to the slender triremes of Greece, Egyptian seagoing ships were broad, sail-powered craft with little maneuverability. They often carried elevated fighting platforms and were manned by archers, spearmen, and sailors schooled in both warfare and navigation. Their chief strength lay in coastal and river mobility, where they could land troops quickly or cut off merchant shipping. Egyptian naval strength also propped up the economy. Grain shipments to the Levant and trade with the Aegean were kept safe by escort vessels. Ports such as Byblos and Tanis turned into centres of both commerce and naval supply. Even foreign kings sought out Egyptian shipwrights for their skill. Over time, Egypt's naval might faded beneath successive waves of foreign rulers, Libyans, Assyrians, Persians, and at last Greeks and Romans. Yet its long record of river and coastal warfare laid the groundwork for naval traditions across the ancient Near East. Egyptian ships may never have ruled the open ocean, but they governed the pulse of empire, sailing wherever the Nile ran, wherever the winds permitted, and wherever power called. When the Roman Republic first climbed to prominence, it was no sea power. Rome's strength lay in its disciplined legions and its talent for building roads, not in shipbuilding. That picture shifted suddenly and sharply once the Republic was drawn into a fierce struggle with Carthage over the Mediterranean. What followed was one of the most striking naval turnarounds in ancient history. At the opening of the First Punic War, in 264 BCE, Rome had scarcely any fleet at all, while Carthage carried centuries of maritime supremacy behind it. The Romans, though, were undaunted. As the story goes, they took a captured Carthaginian quinquereme and used it as their template. Within months, they were turning out warships in bulk, raising hundreds of vessels through sheer manpower and the organizing muscle of the state. Yet Rome recognized it could not match the Carthaginians at seamanship, so it rewrote the contest. In came the corvus, a boarding bridge tipped with a metal spike. This contraction converted naval duels into infantry melees, exactly Rome's strength. With it, Roman marines could storm enemy decks in numbers, recasting sea combat into something far closer to a Roman soldier's element. The outcomes were dramatic. In engagements like Mylae and Cape Ecnomus, Rome's comparatively green crews overcame veteran Carthaginian sailors through sheer ferocity and the power of the corvus. The corvus was eventually set aside, since it left ships perilously top-heavy, but by then it had already swung the war. By the Second Punic War, Rome's naval framework had come of age. Its fleets watched over the western Mediterranean, safeguarded supply routes to Iberia and Africa, and hampered Hannibal's ability to draw reinforcements from Carthage. Blockades and amphibious landings grew into routine tactics. Under the Empire, Roman command of the seas reached still further. The Classus Missenensis and the Classus Ravennas were two of the principal imperial fleets posted to protect trade lanes, stamp out piracy, and ferry soldiers. Though it rarely stood in the spotlight of war, the navy supplied essential logistical and strategic backing, keeping the empire knit together. Unlike Athens or Carthage, Rome never forged a seafaring identity. It treated the sea as an instrument, something to be mastered when the need arose. And yet, by the 1st century CE, Mare Nostrum, RC, was no mere boast. It was simple fact. Rome may have been born on land, but its fate was settled on the water. Through adaptation, invention, and unrelenting will, it changed the sea from a weakness into a stronghold. Ancient naval warfare did more than decide battles. It molded borders, economies, empires, and even cultures. Throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, holding the sea meant far more than winning on the water. It meant sway over the flow of ideas, trade, languages, and the structures of power that would resonate for centuries. Consider first how fleets built empires. Athens rose into a cultural and economic giant on the back of its naval strength. Carthage spun its mastery of the sea into a trading empire. Rome, despite arriving late to the water, leaned on naval dominance to command the whole Mediterranean basin. Each of these powers fielded land armies, yet it was their fleets that allowed them to strike across continents, hold distant lands, and throttle rival economies. The sea acted as a channel for culture too. Greek settlers sailed off to plant colonies throughout Italy and Asia Minor, carrying their art, religion, and language with them. Egyptian ships delivered papyrus, gold, and sacred learning to foreign courts. Phoenician seafarers passed along their alphabet and their gods to nearly every coast they reached. Sea power was never purely military, it was civilizational. In terms of technology, ancient navies drove shipbuilding to fresh heights. The rise of the trireme, and later the larger polyremes, was not only a military leap, it marked a revolution in engineering. Harbours became logistical centres. Navigation methods sharpened. Standardized hull designs set the pattern for maritime construction, still evident in later Byzantine and Islamic fleets. Even economic systems shifted because of navies. Protected sea lanes made stable trade possible over enormous distances, letting luxuries like silk, spices, wine, and tin travel between far-apart cultures. Cities with powerful fleets, such as Alexandria or Rhodes, swelled into rich cosmopolitan hubs. Wherever fleets flourished, so did markets, artists, scholars, and revolutionaries. And then there was the psychological inheritance. Fire ships, ramming runs, boarding assaults, all left a lasting mark on how warfare itself was imagined. They planted the notion that the sea could be a weapon in its own right, that movement and control, rather than brute strength alone, might decide a war. Today we recall many of these empires chiefly for their conquests on land. Their conquests by sea proved every bit as important, and frequently they lasted far longer. Warfare on the ancient waters was never simply a matter of whose vessel moved quickest or whose ram cut sharpest. It came down to who grasped that the sea itself was a kind of theatre, a setting not only for battle but for the unfolding of history. The triremes themselves have long since vanished, yet the disturbance they left behind still spreads outward across the centuries. Cyrus the Great came into the world around 600 before the Common Era, in the territory of Anshan, at that time a vassal realm answering to Median authority. His line, the Achaemenids, asserted a noble pedigree and governed a modest yet respected Persian holding. Nothing in his childhood, though, suggested he would someday assemble one of the most expansive empires humanity had yet witnessed. Even so, legend clung to him from the start. The Greek historian Herodotus hands down one of the most theatrical birth tales in all of ancient biography. As Herodotus tells it, Astyages, king of Media and Cyrus's grandfather, dreamed that a son born to his daughter would cast him from power. The dream readers confirmed exactly what he dreaded. This child would imperil his throne. and so Astyages wed his daughter Mandane to a Persian noble, Cambyses, trusting that any offspring would carry little political weight. Yet the warning visions returned. Once Cyrus was born, the king left nothing to chance. He commanded a trusted servant, Harpagus, to put the infant to death. Harpagus, unwilling to carry out so terrible a deed himself, passed the grim assignment on to a herdsman. But rather than leave the baby to die, the shepherd brought Cyrus up as if he were his own, concealing him among the mountains and raising him as the ordinary child of a herder. As Cyrus matured, his presence and charm grew alongside him. Even in boyhood he was remarkable, directing the other children and revealing a poise well beyond his age. In time, word of this drifted back to the court, a child of evident nobility living the life of a shepherd. Astyages looked into the matter, and the truth came apart at the seams. To everyone's surprise, he let Cyrus live, perhaps judging him no danger, or perhaps weighed down by remorse. Harpagus met no such mercy. In a chilling act of vengeance, Astyages had the man's son killed and served up to him as a dish at court. Cyrus, meanwhile, was returned to Persia, and the household of his father Cambyses, now acknowledged plainly as a prince of noble blood. What the Median king failed to grasp was that he had just guaranteed his own ruin. Cyrus's years spent among both shepherds and nobles had given him a rare insight into people of every station, the mighty and the lowly alike. Whether Herodotus offers fact or fable, the tale conveys the aura that would forever attach itself to Cyrus. From the brink of death in his cradle to a survival that seemed to defy fate, his earliest years sowed the seeds of what was to come. He would not merely defy Astyages, but reshape the very meaning of kingship. By the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era, Cyrus had outgrown the role of mere Persian prince. He had become a shrewd and driven leader, ready to overturn the order of his region. In those days, the Median Empire, under King Astyages, still held authority over Persia. But power was quietly tilting, and Cyrus stood prepared to push it over. The spark was treachery. Several accounts, Herodotus and the Babylonian Chronicle among them, tell that the Median general Harpagus, the same man once ordered to kill the infant Cyrus, had never let go of the memory of his son's terrible end. Now, after the passage of years, he held the means to strike back. In secret, he sent word to Cyrus urging him to rise and pledging backing from within the Median ranks. So began an uprising that would send tremors through the ancient world. Around 553 before the Common Era, Cyrus declared open rebellion. Persia, so long a subordinate kingdom, now proclaimed both its independence and its readiness for war. What came next was no single decisive clash, but a string of drawn-out campaigns. Across 3 years, Cyrus's armies advanced ever deeper into Median lands, gathering support from discontented nobles and allies throughout the region. His name spread, celebrated not only for skill in battle, but for moderation. He frequently spared those who yielded, drawing both dread and admiration. All the while, Astyages' court was coming undone, its loyalties dissolving. When the last reckoning arrived around 550 before the Common Era, it was not the Medes who prevailed, it was Cyrus. Astyages was handed over by his own soldiers, and the once formidable Median Empire fell apart almost in an instant. Cyrus walked into Ecbatana, the Median capital, not as some savage conqueror, but as a ruler of an entirely new sort. He honored local customs, kept the Median administrative framework intact, and brought many Medes into his expanding government. This habit of inclusion would become a defining mark of his reign. With Media in hand, Cyrus drew the Iranian plateau together. Yet this was no ending. It was a starting point. In toppling the Medes, he both freed Persia from its servitude and inherited their entire empire, ruling now over lands reaching from present-day Iran into parts of Central Asia. Fresh from his victory over the Medes, Cyrus the Great looked to the west, toward the dazzlingly rich kingdom of Lydia and its famed ruler Croesus. Croesus was no ordinary monarch. He ranked among the wealthiest men of his age, his very name becoming shorthand for staggering riches. His capital, Sardis, glittered with luxury, and his forces were well supplied with cavalry and battle-hardened soldiers. But Croesus made a fatal error. He took Cyrus too lightly. Hoping to head off Persian expansion, Croesus struck alliances with Egypt and Babylon and put his question to the oracle at Delphi. The oracle famously declared that should he cross the river to attack Persia, he would bring down a great empire. Emboldened, Croesus mounted his invasion, only to learn that the empire destined to fall was his own. The two armies met near the Halys River in 547 before the Common Era. After a hard-fought engagement, Croesus pulled back to Sardis, convinced the fighting season had closed and that he could rebuild his strength in spring with help from his allies. But Cyrus did something no one anticipated. He gave chase. In a daring winter campaign, Cyrus laid siege to Sardis and forced Croesus into a frantic defense. By Herodotus's account, Cyrus even sprang a tactical surprise, sending camels forward to spook the Lydian cavalry, Croesus's greatest strength, leaving it useless. Within weeks Sardis had fallen, and Croesus was taken alive. What followed cemented Cyrus's standing as a ruler like no other. Rather than putting Croesus to death, Cyrus is said to have spared him and even made him a counselor. As the story goes, just as Croesus was about to be consumed by flames, he cried out the name of Solon, a Greek philosopher who had once warned him never to call a man fortunate until the end of his life was known. Cyrus, struck by the tale and the wisdom within it, ordered the fire put out. Myth or truth, the account mirrors the policy of mercy for which Cyrus was known. With Lydia under his control, Cyrus took possession of its vast treasury and trade routes, along with the powerful Greek city-states of Ionia, strung along the Aegean coast. Though the Ionian cities pushed back against Persian rule, they could not withstand Cyrus's growing military and diplomatic apparatus. The collapse of Croesus signaled more than the end of a wealthy kingdom. It confirmed Cyrus's tactical genius and his readiness to wield both force and clemency. It also handed Persia a foothold in the Greek world, laying the groundwork for the clashes between East and West still to come. And for Cyrus, it was simply the next stride in a swiftly widening empire. By the closing years of the 540s before the Common Era, only one great power still stood between Cyrus and unrivaled mastery of the Near East, Babylon. Once governed by kings such as Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon had swelled into a splendid city, renowned for its soaring ziggurats, its enormous double walls, and the legendary hanging gardens. Beneath all that magnificence, however, fractures were spreading. Babylon at the time answered to Nabonidus, a king his own people deeply disliked. His religious decisions had estranged the influential priesthood of Marduk, the city's foremost god. He had passed long stretches away from Babylon, leaving the empire to his son Belshazzar, a figure known to readers of the Hebrew Bible. Resentment was mounting. Cyrus saw his chance. In 539 before the Common Era, Cyrus set his campaign in motion, but unlike earlier invasions defined by siege and ruin, this one was precise. Cyrus's forces beat the Babylonian army at Opis, an important city on the Tigris. There they triumphed, not by arms alone but through persuasion. The Persians vowed to free the people from the misgovernment of Nabonidus, casting Cyrus as one who would restore the divine order. The most remarkable detail is that when Cyrus came into Babylon, he did so without a battle. According to the Nabonidus Chronicle and later Greek writers, the city's gates were thrown open to him, whether through political bargaining or through betrayal from inside. Either way, Cyrus entered Babylon as a deliverer rather than a conqueror. He showed respect to the city's temples, joined in its religious rites, and proclaimed in the celebrated Cyrus Cylinder that Marduk himself had chosen him to bring back peace and justice. That document, frequently described as the earliest charter of human rights in the world, sets down Cyrus's policies of tolerance, the rebuilding of temples, and the return of uprooted peoples. Among those touched by this were the Jews who had been driven from Jerusalem decades before by Babylonian kings. Cyrus issued a decree permitting them to go home and raise the temple in Jerusalem once more, an act so weighty that the Hebrew Bible names him God's anointed, a title otherwise kept for kings of Israel. After his entry into Babylon in 539 before the Common Era, Cyrus the Great did far more than seize the throne. He rewrote what an empire could be. Among the most striking objects to survive from his reign is the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay record inscribed in Akkadian, often celebrated as the first charter of human rights the world has known. While scholars today dispute that label, the cylinder unquestionably offers a revolutionary window into how Cyrus understood power, not as domination, but as stewardship. In its text, Cyrus declares himself chosen by Marduk, Babylon's chief god, to restore order and justice after the misrule of Nabonidus. Yet this was not empty flattery. Cyrus matched his words with deeds. He returned temples to their proper use, allowed displaced peoples to go back to their homelands, and stated outright that he would neither oppress his subjects nor disturb their local traditions. One of the most famous fruits of this policy was the release of the Jews from their Babylonian exile. After decades held in captivity, the Jewish people were permitted to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their ruined temple. The book of Ezra in the Hebrew Bible preserves Cyrus's decree and praises him as an instrument of divine will, something extraordinary for a foreign king. Indeed, Cyrus stands as the only non-Jew the Bible calls a Messiah, an anointed one. The Cyrus Cylinder speaks of freedom, of restoration, and of legitimacy, earned through justice, a sharp departure from the usual rhetoric of ancient rulers who so often glorified conquest and divine retribution. Rather than boasting of cities laid waste or enemies enslaved, Cyrus draws attention to his part as a guardian of varied cultures and faiths. This was not weakness, it was strategy. By honoring local customs, he forestalled rebellion and nurtured loyalty across his enormous empire. Although we must take care not to read modern legal ideas into ancient writing, the spirit of the Cyrus Cylinder stays remarkable. It imagines a world in which rulers find their legitimacy not in fear, but in generosity and inclusion. A replica of the cylinder is displayed today at the headquarters of the United Nations, a testament to its symbolic weight as an early model for governance across many peoples. Cyrus the Great did not merely conquer a sprawling empire, he kept it whole. That may read simply enough, but in truth he governed an astonishingly varied world. Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Elamites, Lydians, Hebrews, and countless others, each with its own tongues, gods, customs, and grievances. What set Cyrus truly apart was not the distance to which he stretched his frontiers, but the deftness with which he managed everything contained within them. At the heart of Cyrus's rule lay a philosophy of tolerance through structure. Unlike many ancient sovereigns who forced their own culture and religion upon the peoples they conquered, Cyrus took up a decentralized approach. He let local leaders keep their places, local religions thrive, and local customs carry on. Rather than grinding his subjects into submission, he set out to earn their trust. And it worked. He kept the administrative machinery of the Mesopotamians and Babylonians intact, adapting it and folding in Persian customs to build an empire that bent without breaking. Authority was handed down to satraps, the provincial governors who managed taxes, kept the peace, and settled disputes within their territories. These men were usually drawn from the local nobility, yet they still answered to the central power that Cyrus held. For generations afterward, this arrangement would underpin Achaemenid rule. Cyrus poured resources into infrastructure as well. He upgraded trade routes, protected caravans, and saw to it that merchants were dealt with fairly. He grasped that trade mattered to stability just as much as soldiers did, so his realm was never merely a war machine. It was a web of commerce and culture reaching from the Indus Valley all the way to the Aegean Sea. He also recognized what symbols could do. In every city he took, Cyrus offered gestures of respect, rebuilding temples, taking part in religious rites, and leaving local institutions standing. Such acts were never just for show. They were calculated pieces of diplomacy that turned former adversaries into loyal subjects. The most striking thing was how seldom his rule sparked opposition. Cyrus did more than keep rebellions at bay. He often earned outright admiration. Even the Greeks, who usually looked down on outsiders as barbarians, regarded him as a wise and fair-minded ruler. Xenophon, the Athenian historian, would go on to compose the Cyropedia, a part-invented but openly admiring account of Cyrus that held him up as the very pattern of enlightened leadership. By the close of his reign, Cyrus the Great had remade the ancient world. Stretching from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of Central Asia, his empire ran wider than any that had come before. Yet, as happens with so many great conquerors, his hunger drove him toward a final campaign, this time into the steppes of the northeast. It would prove to be his last. Around 530 BCE, Cyrus marched to face the Massagetae, a loose alliance of nomadic tribes who lived east of the Caspian Sea. These hardened mounted warriors followed Queen Tomyris, a leader remembered both for her command in war and for her refusal to yield. To the Persians, her people seemed uncivilized but perilous, a danger pressing against the empire's growing frontier. The specifics of the campaign stay hazy, owing much to Herodotus and his dramatic, probably exaggerated telling. By the Greek historian's account, Cyrus first reached for diplomacy, offering marriage to Queen Tomyris. She saw straight through it as the political maneuver it was. When that failed, Cyrus turned to deception, leaving behind a feast of wine and rich dishes, aware that the Massagetae had little familiarity with alcohol. Following a drunken revelry, many of her fighters were ambushed and killed, her son among them. Stricken with grief and fury, Tomyris vowed revenge. In the decisive clash that came next, the Massagetae overpowered the Persian army, and Cyrus fell in the fighting. Herodotus even alleges that Tomyris had his body beheaded and dropped his severed head into a vessel brimming with blood, proclaiming that he should drink his fill of the blood he had so craved. The grisly finale may owe more to legend than to fact, but one thing is sure. Cyrus died on that campaign, far from the great cities he had won. In time, his body was carried back to Pasargadae, the capital he had founded in Persia, and laid to rest in a tomb, modest yet dignified, one that still stands today as a witness to his legacy. His passing closed an era. The throne went to his son Cambyses II, who carried the empire's expansion onward, most notably into Egypt. But the particular mixture of tolerance, strategy, and far-seeing leadership that Cyrus embodied would not be so easily matched. When Cyrus the Great died, he left behind far more than a sprawling empire. He left a political blueprint, a philosophical precedent, and a name so honoured that even centuries later it still stirred awe. The Achaemenid Empire that Cyrus founded was the largest the world had yet known, running from the Aegean to the Indus. But sheer scale was not the whole story. What set it apart was how it worked. Cyrus's habits of inclusion, tolerance, and administrative invention carried on under those who followed him. His son Cambyses II, and later Darius the Great, did not merely enlarge the empire. They gave its structure firm shape. The satrapy system that Cyrus had pioneered grew into a pillar of imperial government. These regional governors upheld order, gathered taxes, and reported straight to the king, which let the empire stay both immense and remarkably efficient. Religious and cultural freedom stayed official policy. Temples and local gods were honored across the realm, from Babylonian ziggurats to Egyptian sanctuaries. Local elites were frequently left in place under Persian supervision, and revolts were uncommon in the early Achaemenid years, not out of dread, but because many subjects found Persian rule gentler than the regimes they had lived under before. Cyrus also did much to shape the notion of kingship as a moral office, not merely a political one. He was not simply king of Persia. He claimed titles such as King of the Four Corners of the World. Yet unlike the swaggering tyrants of earlier days, his right to rule was bound up with the welfare of those he governed. This was no mere propaganda. It marked a genuine turn in how empire was imagined. Good governance had become part of greatness. Even after he was gone, Cyrus's influence lingered. His tomb at Pasargadae, a plain limestone structure, stood as an emblem of humility and endurance. Alexander the Great, himself a master of empire generations later, visited that tomb and is said to have paid his respects, ordering its repair after it had been defiled. Within Persia, Cyrus was not merely remembered, he was venerated. Later, Persian dynasties would call upon his legacy to justify their own authority. Zoroastrian priests linked him with divine justice, and Iranian national identity still celebrates him as the father of the nation. The reach of Cyrus the Great did not stop at his death, nor even at the collapse of his empire. Across the centuries, his legacy spread past borders, faiths, and cultures, fixing him not only as a Persian hero, but as a figure admired the world over, whose example carried down through time. In the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus appears not as a pagan tyrant, but as a liberator chosen by God. The book of Isaiah names him the Anointed of the Lord, a title elsewhere kept for the kings of Israel. His decree permitting the Jews to go home to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple stood as a pivotal moment in Jewish history. To many he endures as a righteous Gentile, an uncommon case of a powerful ruler who turned his strength toward restoring, rather than destroying, faith and freedom. In Greece, even after generations of war with Persia, Cyrus was often cast as the model king. The Athenian writer Xenophon, a pupil of Socrates, produced the Cyropaedia, a partly fictional rendering of Cyrus's life that offered him as the ideal ruler, wise, just, temperate, and brave. Though it was no strict historical biography, it shaped Hellenistic and Roman thinking about leadership and ethics for ages afterward. In the Islamic tradition, some scholars and commentators have linked Cyrus with Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one named in the Quran, a righteous king who raised a great wall to shield people from chaos and injustice. While the identification remains disputed, it speaks to the respect Cyrus draws across the Abrahamic faiths. Modern historians and political leaders have looked to him for inspiration too. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson is said to have kept a copy of the Cyropedia beside his bed. In the 20th century, Iran's last Shah summoned Cyrus as a symbol of national unity and reform, and today the Cyrus cylinder, often called the world's first Declaration of Human Rights, sits on display at the United Nations as an emblem of tolerance and governance. The appeal of Cyrus reaches beyond conquest. He is recalled not for cruelty or empire building alone, but for his rare gift of wielding power with justice. He proved that an empire need not crush difference to keep control, and that rulers could earn loyalty through respect rather than fear. More than 2,000 years on, Cyrus the Great remains a paradox, a conqueror praised for his compassion, a king honored by the very peoples he had subdued. Few figures in history draw such broad admiration, and fewer still have earned it so fully. Under the scorching sun of the Nile Valley, the ancient Egyptians made a daring choice. A great many of them shaved their heads. But this was not simply a practical matter. It was a symbol, a statement, a blank canvas. And onto that canvas, they set some of the most elaborate wigs the ancient world would ever see. Wigs in ancient Egypt were not merely fashionable. They were vital markers of identity, rank, and purity. Men and women of high standing did not just wear them. They displayed them proudly. Nor were these plain accessories. They might be fashioned from real human hair, imported horsehair, or finely woven plant fibers. Wealthy elites often ordered wigs with many layers, intricate braiding, gold beads, and even scented cones set on top, wax-based perfumes that would slowly melt in the heat and wrap the wearer in luxury. For women, hairstyles were tied to femininity, fertility, and power. A noblewoman's wig might be decorated with floral touches, colourful bands, or clasps of precious metal. A priestess might arrange hers in tight, symmetrical rows that echoed the divine order of the gods. For men, especially those serving Pharaoh, a thick, stylized wig signaled not only wealth but nearness to the sacred hierarchy. Children, though, had a look of their own. Many wore the sidelock of youth, a shaved head with a single ornate braid left to hang, a mark of childhood that would be cut away at adulthood or during religious rites of passage. And then there were the priests. In sharp contrast to the extravagance of the court, priests were obliged to shave their entire bodies, heads included, to preserve ritual purity. In public ceremonies, however, even they might don ceremonial wigs, signalling their spiritual office more than any personal identity. More fascinating still is how wigs served even after death. Mummies were frequently buried with their wigs in place, so that their status and beauty might carry on into the afterlife. Hair, in short, was never mere vanity. It was an identity meant to last forever. Picture a Viking, and the mind likely conjures wild beards and braided hair, an image built in equal measure from archaeology, the Norse sagas, and Hollywood. Yet there is a surprising kernel of truth in that picture. Viking hairstyles were anything but random. Hair, in fact, was a potent symbol in Norse society, standing for identity, masculinity, clan loyalty, and even allure. Both Viking men and women took their hair seriously. In a world where appearance broadcast strength and honor, long hair was no idle vanity. It was a declaration. Men often let their hair grow long and styled it with care. Braids, top knots, and half-shaved heads were not just fashionable, they were meant to unsettle. A warrior striding into battle with braided locks and a heavy beard was doing more than keeping hair clear of his eyes. He was advertising his readiness to fight and his refusal to flinch. For Viking women, hair could carry just as much meaning. Long, well-tended hair signaled femininity and high standing. Women often wove their hair into elaborate patterns, sometimes threading ribbons or beads through the strands. A married woman might wrap or partly cover her hair to mark her status, much as a wedding ring does now. Some burial sites in Scandinavia even hold combs, hairpins, and grooming tools, a hint that daily care and pride in appearance mattered to both sexes. There was also an intriguing legal dimension. In Viking law codes, hair had a part to play in justice. Shearing off someone's hair without leave counted as a grave insult, the sort that might bring revenge, legal penalty, or a full-blown blood feud. That was because hair stood for honor. To shame a warrior by cutting his locks was to strike at his very standing in society. And then there is mythology. The Norse gods themselves wore iconic hair. Thor with his blazing red beard. Loki, whose shape-shifting tricks often turned on changes of hair or form. And, of course, the goddess Sif, whose golden hair was so famed that when Loki sheared it off as a prank, he was forced to beg the dwarves to forge a magical replacement out of real gold. Hair was never merely a marker of mortal identity. It could also serve as a kind of sacred coin. The Romans understood control intimately, and that instinct reached all the way to how they wore their hair. In a society where politics, rank, and gender were closely governed, the way one styled one's hair turned into a quiet but potent means of moving through the social order. Among the elite especially, a person's locks might announce their loyalties, their principles, and their drive. Consider Roman men first. In the years of the early Republic, the model citizen was trim, restrained, and useful. Hair was kept short, neat, and carefully tended. Anything beyond that invited suspicion. It might read as unmanly, foreign, or idle. A close cut and a smooth-shaven face went past mere taste. They were declarations of duty, communicating discipline, devotion to the state, and unmistakable Roman identity. Yet, as the empire matured, styles loosened. Rulers such as Nero and Commodus allowed their curls to flourish into showy arrangements that echoed Greek thinkers or even the statues of gods. A few favoured what is sometimes called the Roman top knot, a lifted mass of curled or heaped hair at the brow, shaped to hint at cleverness, youthfulness, or polish. None of this happened by chance. These were deliberately fashioned public faces, and hair had effectively become a tool of persuasion. For Roman women, the stakes climbed higher still. Their hairstyles grew nearly architectural. The celebrated Flavian Tower, a towering pile of curls and braids fixed above the head, was a mark of high standing that depended on enslaved labour, heated irons, and long hours of effort. The grander the creation, the richer the woman, since it proved she commanded both the spare time and the servants to keep it up. Hair could broadcast political allegiance as well. Empresses would unveil fresh styles on statues and coins, which were then imitated by upper-class women throughout the empire. Adopting the empress's look was more than mere compliment, it was a pledge of loyalty. By contrast, enslaved people were generally made to keep their hair short or unadorned, shutting them out of this avenue of expression. Soldiers too kept to plain, serviceable cuts, favouring cohesion and purpose over display. And then came the dissenters. Certain Romans purposely let their hair grow long or borrowed barbarian fashions to register their contempt for imperial ideals. Gladiators, for instance, frequently sported striking hairstyles to craft a stage persona equal parts athlete, performer, and menace. In old Japan, hair was far more than a personal trait. It stood for discipline, obligation, and tradition reaching back generations. Nowhere did this show more plainly than in the famous chômage, the unmistakable topknot of the samurai. This was no ordinary haircut. It amounted to a cultural pact. At the outset, the chômage was simply practical. A shaved crown made helmets, the kabuto in particular, sit more snugly and comfortably during combat. Over time, though, as peace took hold across the Edo period, the style drifted away from warfare and toward identity. The top knot hardened into a fixed emblem of warrior rank, honor, and obedience to Bushido, the warrior's code. To lose it was no trivial trim. It signified a kind of symbolic death. A shamed samurai might be commanded to undo his top knot, or to do so himself, as a sign that he had forfeited his standing. In the gravest cases, the removal of the top knot came just before seppuku, the ritual taking of one's own life to wipe away disgrace. Japanese women's hair carried weighty social meaning too. Throughout the Heian period, from 794 to 1185, noble women grew their hair to remarkable lengths, at times surpassing their own height, letting it fall straight down their backs in a manner known as subarakashi. This spoke not only of beauty but of grace, patience, and rank. Keeping hair so long demanded enormous care, time, and means, the privileges of the aristocracy alone. Later, in the Edo period, women's styles grew steadily more elaborate and formalized. Arrangements like the shimada, a type of coiled bun, were dressed with pins, combs, and ornaments, each detail laden with meaning. Particular styles could signal marital status, age, or even occupation. Courtesans and geisha, for example, wore brilliant and intricate hairstyles, not simply to draw admirers, but to indicate their stage of training and depth of experience. Hair could amount to defiance as well. Under certain shogunate regimes, laws restricted hairstyles according to class, and breaking those rules, even by wearing one's hair the wrong way, could invite suspicion or penalty. Even so, artists, actors, and ronin, the masterless samurai, often bent the codes to make bold statements about who they were and what they refused. In old Japan, hair was tied, both literally and otherwise, to duty, devotion, and drama. Whether in the quiet bearing of a samurai or the graceful coil atop a geisha's head, these styles were acts of storytelling, honor, and lasting cultural memory. Across the African continent of antiquity, hair was no mere matter of style. It functioned as a language. From the careful cornrows of the Sahel to the lofty coils of the Himba, hairstyles worked as identity cards, spiritual statements, and even tools of survival. Long before colonial upheaval, African hair tradition formed a rich weave of symbolism, skilled craft, and resistance. Begin with Nubia, the southern neighbor of ancient Egypt. Nubian communities, too often pushed to the margins of mainstream history, created stylized braids and twists that conveyed status, age, and lineage. Nubian queens, such as Amanirenas and Ameneshaketo, wore elaborate braided wigs and headpieces that matched even Egyptian royalty, declaring their power and beauty in bold, unmistakable fashion. Farther west, in present-day Nigeria, the Yoruba and Igbo peoples already approached hair as an artistic medium. Their intricate styles were not merely decorative, they were carefully designed with specific patterns set aside for brides, warriors, or those entering spiritual life. Hairdressers held great esteem, almost a priestly standing, for to hand someone your hair was to hand them your essence. Among the Himba of Namibia, a red ochre paste blended from powdered stone and butterfat is still applied today to coat and shape elaborate braids. These ochre styles do more than shield hair from the desert. They mark everything from puberty to marital status. For Himba women, hair is quite literally formed by the stages of life. Perhaps the most striking chapter of African hair history, though, lies in how it carried resistance. During the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved Africans turned hairstyles into silent acts of rebellion and remembrance. Cornrows were more than practical. Some patterns served as maps, encoding escape routes or secret meeting places, while others kept alive ancestral styles from home, defying erasure with every twist and braid. In many West African cultures, a shaved head marked mourning or a spiritual passage, while thick locks could stand for strength, a tie to the divine or warrior status. Hair was sacred, never simply ornamental. Colonialism would later cast these styles as shameful, promoting European notions of beauty, yet the ancient roots of African hair culture were never wholly stamped out. They endured in memory, in skilled hands, in braids handed from mother to daughter, and they are now being reclaimed the world over. In ancient Greece, where marble figures and great epics shaped the Western imagination, hair was no simple grooming concern. It was a public showing of virtue, intellect, and civilization. From the tight curls of Athenian youths to the loose flow of philosophers, hair helped settle who a person was in the eyes of the gods and of fellow citizens alike. Take the men first. In earlier times, Greek men often kept long hair, gathered back with ribbons or bands. Epic heroes like Achilles and Odysseus are pictured in verse with flowing or gleaming hair, a sign of vigor, nobility, and the favor of the gods. In those early ages, long hair read as masculine and heroic. By the classical era, however, the picture had shifted. A tidy, fairly short cut became the favored look for Athenian men, though the beard remained. That pairing was the mark of philosophers, statesmen, and teachers. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all wore beards. The beard suggested wisdom and maturity, while the clear brow and open face conveyed candor and reason. A full beard without long, untamed hair implied intellect over impulse, logic over feeling. Slaves and foreigners, by contrast, were sometimes compelled to shave their heads as a sign of submission or lower standing. So, in a curious reversal, keeping one's hair, at least the proper kind, was a political privilege. Women's hair, meanwhile, was bound up with domestic virtue. In public, respectable women were expected to wear their hair gathered and covered, braided or coiled into buns. Letting it hang loose was usually reserved for particular rites, especially mourning or ecstatic worship such as the Dionysian cults, where unbound hair stood for a rupture with order and convention. Girls wore their hair down until puberty, after which a first braid was often cut and offered to Artemis as part of a coming-of-age rite. The act marked both the close of childhood and the start of social duty. Greek goddesses too had their signature hair. Athena's neat, helmet-framed arrangement spoke of strategy and discipline, while Aphrodite's flowing curls suggested sensuality and divine beauty. By imitating these forms, mortals sought to align themselves with the gods and borrow something of their qualities. In ancient China, hair could not be separated from moral philosophy, family obligation, and imperial authority. From the smooth top knots of Confucian scholars to the ornate buns of Tang dynasty court ladies, every strand carried purpose, both aesthetic and symbolic. Hair was not to be altered carelessly. In truth, cutting it was often regarded as a serious wrong. The reason lay in Confucian filial piety. A central teaching of Confucianism held that the body, hair included, was a sacred gift from one's parents. To cut, harm, or needlessly change it was to show disrespect, and this conviction shaped Chinese society for centuries. Even criminals faced the shaving of their hair, not only as a penalty but as a ritual humiliation and a spiritual cutting off. Men generally kept their hair long and bound it into a top knot or bun. Scholars, poets, and officials would pair this with long robes and caps, signaling wisdom, composure, and devotion to order. To encounter a man with loose or dishevelled hair in public was deeply unsettling, hinting at madness, mourning, or rebellion. For women, hairstyles depended heavily on age and status. Young girls often wore twin buns or side ponytails, styles that marked them as unmarried. With marriage, a woman's hair was restyled into something more mature and formal, frequently a single coil or bun pinned with combs, jade ornaments, or gold hairpins. Court ladies and empresses of the Tang dynasty carried this to spectacular heights, quite literally, sculpting their hair into towering forms decorated with phoenix pins, flowers, and silk. Politics found its way into hair as well. Changes of dynasty often brought forced changes in appearance. When the Manchu-led Qing dynasty conquered Ming China, they imposed the queue, the front of the head shaved and the rest braided into a long plait. This style became a despised emblem of submission to foreign rule, and many Han Chinese resisted, choosing death over what they regarded as a betrayal of their cultural identity. In a different vein, Taoist monks shaved their heads completely to cast off worldly ties, and Buddhist monks did likewise, showing their detachment from the material world and their acceptance of impermanence. In ancient India, hair was not merely a physical feature, it was sacred. It was woven together with the ritual purity, caste identity, and spiritual symbolism, becoming a potent vehicle for both devotion and social control. From the twisted locks of sages to the shaved heads of pilgrims, hair in Indian culture told layered stories of belief, discipline, and transformation. Begin with the sadhus, the wandering holy men who turned away from worldly life. Their hair was never cut, combed, or restrained. Instead, they let it grow into thick, matted locks called jata. These strands stood for spiritual power and a release from material concern. The longer and wilder the hair, the stronger the statement. This was someone who had risen above vanity, family, and even selfhood. Sadhus modelled themselves on Lord Shiva, the god of destruction and meditation, whose own jata was said to restrain the mighty Ganges. For others, however, a shaved head represented the very summit of holiness. In Hindu practice, those making pilgrimages would commonly shave their heads before entering holy places, presenting the hair as a sign of devotion and a way of becoming pure. A child's earliest haircut, plain as it seemed, served as an important threshold in life, thought to wash away misfortune carried over from earlier existences. The rites observed after a death likewise called for a man's nearest male kin to shave their heads, a gesture of modesty and of letting go of earthly ties. Hair carried other meanings too, signalling one's caste and whether one was wed. Men of the higher castes would keep a lone lock at the top of the head, the shika, once the rest had been removed. That tuft was no idle choice. It identified the wearer as twice born, a member of the priestly or learned order who was bound to carry out sacred duties. To sever the shika for no good reason was treated almost as banishment from society. The styles worn by women were no less laden with meaning. Girls who had not yet married usually let their hair hang free or wore plain braids, whereas wives gathered theirs into knots or wound it close. A glossy, carefully plaited style spoke of self-control, of beauty, and of a family's good name. The decorations differed with region and means, yet jasmine blossoms, golden pins, and ornamental combs often appeared at festivals and marriage ceremonies. Hair was tied, as well, to ideas of desire. Old writings, such as the Kama Sutra, speak of alluring ways of arranging it, and the carvings at temple complexes like Khajuraho show women whose elaborate locks pour down their backs like sculpted water. Across the ancient world, the way one wore one's hair was never only a means of belonging. It could also be a way to be noticed, to push back, to defy. In a great many cultures, altering or refusing the prevailing style became an act of resistance, quiet or open, against custom, against ruling powers, against systems that pressed down on people. Consider Judea under Roman rule, where the Jewish people, living by exacting religious law, kept away from the lavish grooming the Roman upper classes prized. Many Jewish men would not trim their beards or arrange their hair in the Roman manner, holding to a separate identity grounded in their faith. For them, hair was not a matter of fashion but of belief. And within an empire so fixed on drawing everyone into one mould, that appearance amounted to a hushed kind of protest. In Gaul, during the campaigns of Julius Caesar, the Celts were noted for their untamed hair, washed with lime until it stood rigid and pale, frequently raised into crests resembling a mohawk. Roman authors regarded it as savage, yet to the Gauls it was something like war paint grown straight from the scalp. The look struck fear into foes while drawing the tribes together in their stand against Roman occupation. The Parthians and the Sassanids who followed them, two mighty realms lying east of Rome, turned their appearance into a weapon as well. Their rulers wore long, curled hair and heavy beards, marks of God-given authority and of pride in their heritage. To Roman eyes it seemed strange and unmanly. To the Persians it was the very image of royalty and ancestry. Their hair announced a clear message: we are not you. Even where life was tightly bound by control, hair could still serve as a form of defiance. People held in bondage across many empires, from Greece to the Americas, were often made to shave their heads as a means of erasing who they were. Yet when the chance came, they turned to hair to keep their lineage, their memory, and their will to resist alive. Braids could hide seeds, beads could carry meaning, and certain styles could trace out maps, old stories, or hidden messages. Women resisted through hair as well. In Sparta, women who had not married were known for cropping their hair short, unlike the long tresses of women elsewhere in Greece, a sign of self-reliance and of being prepared for physical effort. Roman women now and then turned away from the reigning court fashions to fall in line with philosophical convictions such as Stoicism or the early Christian faith, taking up plainer, more restrained styles. And when rulers were brought down, their hairstyles came down with them. To cut away hair worn in the imperial style could be a perilous yet daring declaration of where one's political loyalties or grievances truly lay. In every one of these instances, hair was not simply a reflection of the surrounding world. It was an instrument for remaking it. Throughout the ancient civilizations, when voices were hushed or blades were unsheathed, the scalp turned into a surface for resistance. A braid, a shaved head, a single curl. It could cry out more fiercely than any spoken word would ever dare.